This is the future of energy in South Carolina with Andy Brown from the Post and Courier. Before we begin, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about what we do. My name is John Brooker. I'm with MUSC Sustainability and Recycling. So we work on various initiatives across campus, such as recycling and waste management, energy and water, food, transportation, climate, and green building. We also record all of these. We have these on a monthly basis on different topics, and we upload them to our YouTube channel, which you can find through our website or just by searching MUSC Sustainability. And then also our next event will be on January 15th with Charleston Moves. So they recently received funding for a bike pedestrian bridge across the Ashley River. So they'll explain kind of what's going to happen with this, what the process looks like going forward, and then also talk about just their complete streets and other advocacy work towards bikes and pedestrians. And the last slide I have before I turn it over to Andy is to sign up for our Green Team email list. So this is a monthly newsletter we have that tells you about events just like this. The signups are at the front. You can also follow us on social media through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as Yammer. And that's it. So I'll turn it over to Andy Brown with the Post and Courier. Thank you, Andy.
Hey, thanks, guys. Again, I'm Andrew Brown with the Post and Courier. I have been in South Carolina now for about 3 years. For most of that time, I was covering the South Carolina legislature. I was essentially a political correspondent up there, but I covered a bunch of different topics. One of the first topics that got thrown in my lap whenever I got here was the cancellation of 2 nuclear reactors in South Carolina, which was a multi-billion-dollar failure that ratepayers, customers of most electric customers in South Carolina, will continue to pay for. I want this to be rather interactive. I think I've done a lot of coverage on this, so I don't want to assume that you guys understand all of essentially the baselines of how the electric utility system in South Carolina works. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. It'll probably make this more instructive. So South Carolina is a regulated utility market. That means that whichever company, whichever utility is supplying electricity to you has a monopoly. You can't go and solicit another utility company to provide electricity to your home or business or this campus here. They have set markets, and within that geographic boundary, they serve you. And they determine essentially what your bill is going to look like and where you get your energy from, and all these aspects of the energy production in South Carolina. South Carolina currently, you can see on the map there on the left, has some of the highest electric utility rates in the country. It's so the dark green, which South Carolina is in, is the average monthly bill can be from $140 per month to $169 per month. It's quite a big price tag for a residential customer. And the fact that we're almost comparable to Hawaii, where they can't pump in gas or bring power from the continental United States, it's quite a stark comparison. They have a lot of other problems in Hawaii getting electricity there compared to South Carolina. So it just says something about what our utility system looks like currently as far as price. I did want to show you that map on the right here. It's an interactive map if you ever want to check this out. This is the SCE&G office. It's a state agency that does a bunch of stuff with natural gas, electricity, and a bunch of other issues. So what you see here, this Technicolor map of all these different colors, those are all those shades represent a different utility sector. So each one of those colors is where an individual utility supplies electricity. How I said they have monopolies, this is what the monopoly system looks like in South Carolina. So, and I'm going to do some editing here, but if you go here, the major utilities in South Carolina, dark blue here, is a Duke utility, which is their parent company is up in North Carolina. The Tan is another Duke utility, again, based in North Carolina. All of the blue in there is sectors of SCE&G, or SCANA, or now what is called Dominion. They were taken over. And the green is Santee Cooper, which is our state-run utility here in South Carolina. We'll get into all this a little bit. This is all important to understand if you're going to understand what's going on now in South Carolina's energy. Now you'll see if I add in the electric cooperatives serve rural territories that these investor-owned or these larger utilities don't manage because it was too costly to essentially put electricity lines into rural areas. And so in the 1900s, co-ops were created all over the country, not just here in South Carolina, to serve rural areas. And they're actually owned by their members. So if you're an electric payer to a co-op, you're a member of that. You actually own part of it. They fill in the gaps around these other big utilities. They don't produce any of their own electricity, the co-ops, but they buy it from other utilities like Santee Cooper and sell it then to their end customers.
So what is solar fit in?
Coming.
Okay.
How many force are there?
That's okay.
How many?
There are 20 electric cooperatives in South Carolina, and then there's Duke Power, which has two utilities in the upstate and the PD, so around Florence, and then you have SCE&G, which is now owned by Dominion, which covers Columbia, Aiken, Charleston, and then there's Santee Cooper. It has power plants in different parts of the state, but mostly supplies power directly to people in the Grand Strand area and into Georgetown.
Duke, Santee Cooper, and
That's correct. Those are the big three to remember here in South Carolina. So what made yeah, absolutely.
Santee Cooper is on state line.
That is correct. They were created 85 years ago this year. And they came out of the New Deal era where they were trying to electrify rural parts of the country. And so the state created Santee Cooper and the lakes, Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion, to start powering parts of the state of South Carolina that didn't have electricity. So they operate a little differently than the investor-owned utilities, which are publicly traded companies on Wall Street. They're partly owned by the state, but they operate on their own margins. All of their revenues come from their customers.
Real quick,
Yeah.
the breakdown between Duke, because I remember there was a dark blue and a tan. What was the reason for that again?
So Duke Energy at one point only owned the tan portion, right? And then in 2008, 2009 timeframe, they purchased another utility that operated in the upstate. And so it's two separate utilities as far as legal, a legal entity is concerned, but they're owned by the same parent company. Pretty complicated, I know. It gets a little complicated, but you just have to remember that there's three big power providers in South Carolina: Duke, Dominion, Santee Cooper. So what kind of sparked all the headlines in the past 3 years now was the cancellation of the VC Summer Nuclear Project. The VC Summer Nuclear Project, I can show you if I go back to this map. It's this site right here. It's up in Fairfield County. They already have an existing nuclear reactor there, but what occurred in the past decade was Santee Cooper, the state-run utility, and SCE&G partnered to build two brand new reactors. They started on that construction in 2009, continued to progress. We got to July 2017 after they racked up billions of dollars in costs, and they abandoned it because they were falling behind, and the cost became so huge that they recognized that it was actually cheaper for them to stop than to continue and try and finish. They have since moved. Both companies have continued to charge customers for those reactors. So, for instance, if you're a Dominion customer, or formerly SCE&G, you'll pay, all the customer base will pay over $2 billion in the next 20 years for those plants. And if you're Santee Cooper customer or co-op customer, because Santee Cooper supplies their power, you're still paying like around 5% of your bill for those nuclear reactors.
So these companies are regulated by the pollution.
Yes.
Right, so how can they do that? That doesn't seem
They-
intuitively legal.
So in South Carolina, what happened prior to the nuclear project getting its start, the legislature passed a law, so this is your state lawmakers, passed a law that said you can charge people in advance while you're constructing this project. And they included a clause in the language of the bill that said if it's canceled, you can still charge them. So very poor thinking on the legislature's part. Not fully understanding what they were. The utility drafted the law, and the lawmakers passed it in whole. And so that was SCE&G's portion. Now, Santee Cooper isn't regulated by anybody. They are regulated by their board of directors because they're state-run, right? So Duke and Dominion have to go before this Public Service Commission in South Carolina, and they anytime they want to increase customers' bills, they have to go there, show that they've spent X number of dollars, prove that it was a legitimate expense, then they can raise people's bills. Santee Cooper makes those decisions based solely on their board of directors, which is selected by the legislature.
So Duke and Old Dominion, we're paying for it still now. So
Not Duke, not
I
Duke.
mean, not-
Yeah, Duke and Dominion and Santee Cooper. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
So they have to recoup all the cost outlays, the capital outlays that they funded?
Yes. Well, they Dominion has said they've agreed to write down essentially you would be paying more, but whenever Dominion took over SCE&G, they told customers that essentially we'll cover around $2 billion in the cost. We need you guys to cover $2.3 billion. And that's what.
Not the whole thing.
Then there's Santee Cooper's portion, which is a 45% ownership. Those bonds are still outstanding. They issue public bonds, and they have just under $4 billion in bonds remaining. Huge
But are being paid.
through customer the rates. So it was a big idea in 2009. They thought that South Carolina was going to move away from coal plants with these new nuclear reactors. They were going to cut down on carbon emissions. They're going to do all these things. What resulted was a fiasco. They spent more than $9 billion before they canceled the two utilities. The legislature opened investigations after it was canceled. Dozens of lawsuits were filed by lawyers representing ratepayers. And there's an ongoing criminal investigation into whether SCANA misled investors about the health of the project. Has turned into a huge black eye for the nuclear industry in in the country. These were two of only 4 new nuclear reactors that have been attempted in like the past 3 decades. There's a pair of reactors that are almost identical in Georgia, just over the line in Georgia, that are still being constructed, but are running into similar cost overruns and delays. It's very costly and tough to build a nuclear reactor. And it's what's resulted. So the industry has kind of fallen off, the nuclear industry, which many environmentalists thought were going to be the solution to trying to move away from carbon emissions.
So I don't know if you look into that, but is this a situation that's germane only to the United States? I mean, other countries have difficulty building nuclear plants as well?
There has been very little new nuclear construction in the world in the past 30 years. France is moving away from its aging nuclear fleet. Obviously, Japan has had some issues since Fukushima. So nuclear is somewhat waning now. There's talk of Saudi Arabia possibly building nuclear reactors there, but it's all really up in the air, and there's still a lot of unsolved questions. I explained what already happened with all the lawsuits and where things stand for customers. What VC Summer did, if you ignore the controversy over the creation of the nuclear reactors, is it threw South Carolina into a really questionable stance on where we go from here for our energy needs. These 2 nuclear reactors were supposed to supply together like 200 megawatts of energy, which is a huge amount of energy. SCANA or SCE&G and Santee Cooper were supposed to, as a result, close some of their coal plants that were operating. Now they're left in the lurch. You need energy. You don't have what you paid for producing electricity, and so you have to get a supply from elsewhere. So both utilities are now, SCE&G was purchased by Dominion, which is a Virginia-based company, very large utility. They're all having to kind of refigure out what their energy future looks like. And so that brings us to where we are, right? These companies are trying to figure out what the energy mix in South Carolina is going to look like over the next 3 decades. Who's going to own that power supply? And so this is where solar comes in. There are 2 types of solar usually in the country. There is the solar panels that you see on people's rooftops. It's residentially owned. So the homeowner or a small business will install the panels themselves or pay someone to install the panels. And then their bill gets credited for the excess power they produce and supply to the utility. The other way that solar industry is involved in South Carolina is there are large corporations that build large solar arrays, meaning they're the solar farms you see, like several dozen acres of just solar panels in a line. These third-party companies can build those, but in order to supply people in South Carolina, they have to go to the Public Service Commission and the utility and work out a deal with them. And the only way, so the utility can, under federal law, has to accept this solar energy that's being produced from these independent solar farms as long as they meet a certain price point, right? Essentially what federal law says and what state law says is you don't want someone building a solar field and then charging consumers for that if the price is so astronomically high that the utility could produce energy cheaper. So the PSC, again, the Public Service Commission of South Carolina, it's a 7-member commission up in Columbia. They decide what those rates are. What price point is the utility required to purchase that solar energy? Okay, they just had a big case on this. These are like this is like a courtroom. If you're unfamiliar with the PSC, there's attorneys representing all the sides, and the public service commissioners sit up at the front like judges. They listen to all of the testimony, all of the scientific evidence, all of the engineering arguments, and then they have to make their decision. That lasted several months, and what the PSC ultimately decided here last month, they set a price that the independent solar companies say is going to essentially put them out of business. They're not going to be building new solar farms in South Carolina, right? Because they're saying the price is so low, we can't get financing for it. The utilities have said, well, that ultimately whatever we have to buy from these companies gets passed on to customers. We just don't want them overpaying. What it does, though, is it keeps the norm, which is these utility companies largely have a business model where they make money and a set profit off of building things. They like to own the energy production because that makes them a profit, right? And so if an independent company like the solar companies are coming in and instead producing that electricity, there's no profit margin there for the utility. So it's created this really difficult dynamic, and there's a lot of legal back and forth going on right now trying to figure out whether that decision will be challenged and how much solar growth there will be in South Carolina in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Isn't Santee Cooper kind of relying on solar, though, to get out of the hole with this debt? So they're talking about increasing it 500%. So how do they fit into this? You're mentioning Dominion and Duke are private utilities.
Right.
State-owned. So how would they fit in this scenario?
Santee Cooper has put forward a new business plan here after all of this happened. If you don't know, Santee Cooper is possibly on the selling block. The state legislature is considering whether to sell Santee Cooper, the state-run utility, to a Duke or Dominion type investor-owned utility. That'll be decided here next year. It's coming up. Santee Cooper, to kind of forestall and possibly convince the legislature to keep them under state control, has put forward a business plan. And as part of that, they're going to shut down some of their aging over the next 10 years. Their plan is to shut down some of their aging coal-fired power plants. They have two, one near Georgetown and one up near the lakes at Cross. It's called the Cross Station. And what's going to result is they're going to add some solar in the meantime. They're going to add quite a bit of solar, including battery backup, where if the sun isn't shining, you'll have energy stored in these batteries, can be then put onto the grid. But they're also considering adding new natural gas-fired power plants in the state in the next 10 years. And a large chunk of their energy in the long term will come from that natural gas. Natural gas fits, if you don't know, most engineers would say this, that the natural gas fits much more closely and works better with renewable energy. You know, sun isn't always shining, wind isn't always blowing. And so what you do, gas plants can start up very quickly. So you can have all these renewable resources, and if they're not producing as much energy, then you start up the gas plant, right? It can turn on within hours, right, and start producing electricity. Coal and nuclear can't do that. Coal takes quite a while to get the boilers moving and get the electricity flowing. Nuclear has to run constant because it's a nuclear reaction that's happening in that core. And so a lot of utilities across the country right now are moving towards a mix of renewables and natural gas. And that's what you're seeing Santee Cooper do as well, or at least what they plan to do if they remain under the state control. Does that answer your question? It's no. What can I help you understand?
Well, I just think of this, my concern is after we talk about natural gas being in this mix, but we also, well, I don't know how many people realize that natural gas is problematic also. There's a reason that natural gas fell out of favor over the years and is trying to make a comeback is because it involves fracking. You get natural gas, which is a huge environmental issue, the earthquakes and then groundwater situation. And then pipelines tend to be sent through marginalized communities. And that's an issue also because pipelines leak. So for Santee Cooper to propose that is a major concern.
No, it's not just Santee Cooper. So I have the second.
It's not just Santee Cooper, but it's a major concern.
Yeah.
And there's certain voices that are not at the table when these decisions are being made.
Most of the energy decisions in this, in the state and most of the country, are made within boardrooms and stuff like that. It's just, or at the federal, you know, there's state regulation at the Public Service Commission, and then there's federal regulation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They permit pipelines, they permit a bunch of different things as far as energy consumption and energy use goes in the United States. The big thing to watch, speaking of natural gas, there is a pipeline that is currently in the works. It's called the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. It will, as permitted right now, run from West Virginia to the border of North Carolina, just over the border near Lumberton, North Carolina. That is on hold until the Supreme Court here decides whether its permits can go forward and they can continue construction. But I mentioned this pipeline because it is a huge part of what Duke and Dominion, the two largest investor-owned utilities in South Carolina, are looking at. They are the constructors and owners of that pipeline, and would receive a profit for every cubic foot of gas that goes through it. And so they have a huge incentive to possibly build and extend that pipeline into South Carolina to supply power plants and to supply homes and businesses that have natural gas lines going to them. That's an upcoming debate. They have yet to suggest that they're going to extend it into South Carolina, but their CEOs have suggested as much, that they would consider it. So there's quite a lot. See, the vacuum of VC summer, where all this electricity production was supposed to happen, has opened this vacuum for the pipeline builders to step into and say, well, you guys need more energy, or we think you need more energy, and so we can supply it through this means. Some other things to watch for in the next year, besides Santee Cooper possibly being sold by the legislature, there is an election of the state's utility commissioners on the Public Service Commission. You guys don't get a vote on that. Your state lawmakers do. So you elect the people who elect them. It's the system here. It's not everywhere, but so essentially 4 members of the Public Service Commission that were on this panel whenever they oversaw the VC Summer project, 2 of them will be rerunning for their seats. So four commissioners could be replaced in total, and that would completely wipe the board of any of the people that were on there during the nuclear failure. People are closely watching this. I think lawmakers, for the first time in probably over a decade, are quite interested in who gains those seats. For quite some time, it was kind of an afterthought. They just appointed the people who gained favor in the legislature. So I think it'll be more closely watched this time around. But that's something that will impact a huge part of South Carolina's energy future, because these are the people that ultimately make the decisions of what these utilities can and can't do.
So the Bowman area seems to be very solar friendly. Do you expect that trend to keep going?
Sorry, which area?
Bowman.
Boeing? South?
Bowman.
Oh, Bowman. Yeah,
Orangeburg.
yeah. Part of that some of them were these independent solar providers, and so if they can't get a contract with the utility they want to sell power to, they're not going to build it. That's the whole makeup. Now, one of the recent announcements up there was the co-ops decided, and Google, their data center, decided that they would essentially help finance some of that. So there's 2 big solar arrays that are going in there, where the co-ops will be the end-use customers, along with that Google data center up in Berkeley County, claiming the energy, essentially the renewable credits, saying, we helped provide this, and so we get to claim that we're being green because we helped produce this renewable energy source.
Hey, Andy, so the PSC's ruling on the price that solar has to be bought at kind of makes these private companies less likely to be able to do it. Almost impossible due to the rate they're going to pay them, and then also that there's like a term limit on the contract, which is too short. Does that mean that, is there any chance of utilities themselves making solar arrays?
Yes, that's the thing, right? Both Duke and Dominion say they are pro-solar. There's a thing I think a pretty normal rule that you should know about the way that regulated utilities operate is they're okay with any type of energy mix to a large degree, as long as they own it. Because if they own it, they right now, I believe Duke gets a rate of return on any of their investments of around 9%, over 9% return for their investors, their equity holders. And Dominion gets even higher, like 10%. And so anything they build, right, that was part of the incentive for VC Summer. They were going to spend billions of dollars, and on each dollar they spent, they were going to get a 10% return, right? That's their business model. That's pretty normal. That goes back the whole way to like the 1900s, right? People developed these regulated utilities because you didn't want 2 companies or 3 companies building power lines at the same spot. So you gave them their monopoly areas, because then you wouldn't duplicate power lines and power plants. The point is then that's why you have the Public Service Commission to essentially act as a check if you're a monopoly, you can charge whatever you want, right? Nobody else is there to provide that power. It's up to the utility commissioners to say this is the price you get to charge.
What's the reasoning, the understanding of the last month's solar decision?
The PSC essentially said they went with their independent. They hired an independent consulting firm to help advise them on what price they should set. That was established by the legislature. The lawmakers said they should hire this consulting firm, as well as an independent Office of Regulatory Staff. They're a utility watchdog in the state. They kind of represent consumers in these utility cases. The utility commissioners kind of took the price point that those two entities suggested. So it's not completely on the utility commissioners. It's the evidence that they're presented too. And so there's a lot of frustration among the solar providers. It's a really, really complicated forecasting that you have to get into to figure out that. And I guess the question is whether the state wants to put a higher value on solar. And that, the legislature could be more forceful in writing laws to mandate a certain amount of renewable energy and stuff like that, but that hasn't been set.
So what do you know, have you looked into that consulting company?
Yes.
Is that the folks from Clemson?
No. They are. There's some industry types that just operate in the PSCs doing the mathematics and the.
From out of state, though, they're not from South.
No. So. Yes.
To be fair, many of the state legislators are not happy with the PSC's decision.
That's right.
And so organizations like ours, I work for Conservation Voters of South Carolina, we're doing town halls around the state with different state legislators. There's going to be one in Columbia on December the 10th, and we're putting one together in Charleston on December 16th at North Charleston City Hall from 5:30 to 7. So there'll be state representatives, senators, and House representatives, people there and other Conservation Coalition members to voice their displeasure. It's illegal to not illegal. There's certain ways that you have to reach out to the PSC because they're considered judges, they're quasi-judicial.
Right.
So legislators can't just reach out and touch them, but they can make noise. And so these town halls are just our way to help amplify the voices of people like yourselves and state legislators who are not happy with those decisions.
Right. It's true. I mean, some of the lawmakers who passed the law that started this whole process with re-looking at the price of solar that these utilities would offer to independent solar companies, they're quite frustrated. They believe that the price should have been set higher. I suspect that will weigh into who they select for the PSC commission next year as well. So,
I asked a question because I think I read in your paper that company has very close tie to the power company.
They jettisoned that. No, that was the first consultant they hired, and I wrote that story. They then axed that company and got a different consultant.
That doesn't have ties with the.
Yeah, I didn't find any.
The people who are on the PSC, these guys make six figures and are very heavily quoted by people like Duke, Santee Cooper. So I see how they're untouchable by the public, but they go to dinners and they get bought basically.
I covered after the VC summer collapse. One of the stories I did, I think it was like probably right before the new year in 2017, turning into 2018. I wrote a story about the PSC commissioners. I found all these expense reports where they were traveling to utility-funded conferences all over the country. Part of that is they argued was for continuing education so they can be informed. They had been, I haven't checked the record since, but they went to a lot of conferences where their utility backed, and there's golf outings and fancy dinners and get-togethers. And so needless to say that, you got to watch who's in power, right? I think it's not just South Carolina, I think in most parts of the country, the the average person does not understand what public service commissions do and how vital they are to most people's daily lives. I mean, I don't know anybody who doesn't have a water bill, electricity bill, or gas bill, you know? So these people are quite powerful.
How did the solar farm in Bowman, and it seems like the archaeology, it seems like the town, the local government had a lot to do with getting that done.
So they have been, right, some of the local governments in South Carolina have been offering them what are known as filates, or fee in lieu of taxes. So instead of paying certain taxes, they would reduce their how much taxes they're assessing on these solar farms, which makes it easier for them to build. But ultimately, if they can't sell the power, right, they're not going to build it. And so unless they get what they believe are favorable terms from the utilities, those tax incentives don't quite help. That's where it becomes complicated. And, you know, the industry right now, I don't work in it. I probably don't even know enough about how the price points that would make it profitable. But, you know, the industry as a whole is arguing right now that they don't expect anyone to do business with Duke or Dominion and create a new solar farm in South Carolina if these prices are maintained. That's their argument. We'll see if it bears out over the next couple of years.
When South Carolina Electric and Gas sold out to Dominion, my credit for my solar completely, essentially disappeared.
Really?
Yeah.
That was one of the things that I was going to talk about here. It's actually at the bottom here.
It's really disappointing.
So the PSC went in and reviewed the solar farms relationship with utilities, right? They're now going to be in the next couple months or next year reviewing their relationship with residential solar owners. Then it's called net metering, I'm sure you're aware. So they're going to figure out how customers will be credited and at what price they'll be credited for the excess power they produce and provide onto the grid.
But Dominion already did that when they took over.
They may have changed it, but this is there's the law that was passed last year is mandating that the PSC review it and set new rules. So that's upcoming as well. Needless to say, the energy industry in South Carolina is just in flux right now. It's like there's everything going on.
We had a situation in the city of Georgetown, where I'm from, where the city started charging solar users, if you're at your house, $50 a month to calculate their bill, because they didn't have the software.
Where was this?
In Georgetown. They didn't have their software in the computers to calculate it. In the computer. So they were calculating solar bills by hand and charging $50 a month.
Which utility is this?
City of Georgetown, which has a
Oh, they have a
contract with Santee Cooper to provide electricity. So the city of Georgetown, in a simple way, acts as a co-op. They buy the electricity.
They're a municipal.
Yeah, they're municipal.
Okay, yeah, they're. I should have made that clear.
Yeah.
There's co-ops, and then there's around 21 municipal electric utilities,
Yeah.
city-run utilities in the state
They
too.
have a 10-year contract with Santee Cooper, but they started charging $50 a month for solar customers because they couldn't calculate their bill in the computer. They had to do it by hand. And just for full disclosure, I'm CEO of the Delegate Chamber of Commerce, and I, along with Coastal Conservation League, went to the city meeting and basically during public comments argued against that because it's a regressive tax. And the bottom line, a lot of people who were interested in getting in solar started thinking about that's $600 a year, just to pay my bill to the city.
Yeah, that's.
But
I
they
had no
did
idea
defer
about
it.
that.
I guess the city, they at that point they did defer it in that meeting for further study, and I don't know where it stands right now. But
Interesting.
it actually goes to show the flux in the energy industry and what's going on with Santee Cooper really does impact daily decisions. It really impacts real people who are out there trying to find the best case scenario when it comes to energy.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is people's what excess monthly income you have.
Yeah.
I have one last slide, I think. So I told about the new PSC selection. State lawmakers, this is going to be the big one, are going to be deciding next year whether Santee Cooper is sold. That's huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar transaction with possibly one of the biggest transactions the state government has ever, if they do this, one of the biggest transactions they've ever entered into. So
Essentially, who would they sell it?
right now, on earnings calls, Dominion's not interested in owning it. They want to manage it. So whenever the legislature comes in next year, there's going to be 3 offers on their desk. There's going to be the offer from Santee Cooper to stay under state control. There's going to be an offer from some investor-owned company to manage Santee Cooper for the state. So instead of having state employees, you'd have a contractor running the power plants, making sure the power lines are up and running, that type of thing. That's pretty normal in the industry. And then third would be a complete takeover where the assets are actually sold to a company like an investor-owned utility. There's 2 companies that I know of have confirmed they've submitted bids to take over. That's Duke, which owns already a huge swath of South Carolina, and NextEra, which is one of the largest investor-owned utilities in Florida. Yeah.
That is a big deal, but I would also like to champion the fact that the PSC elections are really, really big.
Yeah.
And
Let's put it this way. If Santee Cooper is sold to a NextEra or a Duke, the PSC is going to be the ones that's deciding what that company gets to do with Santee Cooper. So it's all relevant. It all goes together.
If Santee Cooper is sold, does the PSC go away?
No. Their Santee Cooper's board goes away. So they are currently regulated, because they're state run, by their own board of directors, which is appointed by the governor and selected by the legislature. That will be wiped away. Then they'll be treated like any other investor-owned utility and regulated.
Regulated under the PA.
Correct.
Right. The current board.
I know this is complicated, and I apologize. It's just a lot to.
Good information.
It seems like the PSC and Santee Cooper are almost one. But they're not.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah.
They're not.
The other things to watch: Dominion, which owns SCE&G, has said during their earnings call that they are going to come in and file a rate case with the PSC, which could increase customers' bills further. And Duke Energy is fighting a decision by the PSC that they don't like, which didn't allow them to charge for coal ash cleanup in North Carolina. They're taking that to the state Supreme Court to challenge it.
So explain that. So the South Carolina Public Service Commission did not allow them to raise rates
To the level they wanted. Yeah.
Coal ash cleanup in North Carolina.
Some of the power for Duke Energy's utilities in South Carolina produced in North Carolina, which means that they help pay for those power plants, right? The electric grid is not, it's self-contained, right? There's power plant.
I got you.
They're all connected, and so the power from plants over the border in North Carolina power homes and businesses in South Carolina, and sometimes the opposite way, And so they have all these coal ash ponds that the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality is saying you have to clean up and put into a lined landfill. They want customers to pay for it. The State Office for Regulatory Staff said no. Now it's being appealed to the state Supreme Court of South Carolina.
So it's a very highly regulated industry.
It's probably the most regulated industry in the country.
So how come then only 2 states, South Carolina and Alabama, have the highest rates? I mean, is it a matter of what are the cost drivers?
It depends on what utility you have there, what type of energy production, what type of power plants they created back in the day.
Yeah, but there's got to be some best practices. That
Sure.
the state is
A lot of it has to do with who's on the Public Service Commission.
Okay, so that's it.
To a large degree, yeah. I
And
mean,
neither the Public Service Commission nor the State Board are a good reflection of the demographics of the state of South Carolina.
that's very true. Yeah.
Hey, Eddie, have you seen any difference in other states, being more fiscally responsible and having these lower rates based on if they are public owned or if they're private and then have a PSC?
It's funny. It's so
Better model.
I think it's just you have to have like thoughtful people who are like keeping an eye on this.
Accountability.
It's
So it doesn't matter whether it's this way or this way.
well. Let me give you an example. PG&E, which is in California, the largest investor-owned utility in California right now, they're in a bunch of trouble because their power line started some fires out there, right? So they're in bankruptcy right now. Some of the cities in California are considering a bid to take over and turn them into a public utility. It's the opposite that's going on here, where Santee Cooper lawmakers consider privatizing. The advantage of Santee Cooper, and they're going to stress this a lot over the next year, is that they don't have equity holders. They're not paying a 10% return or giving dividends to equity holders. They issue public bonds at an interest rate that the investor-owned utilities can't even get close to. And that would hopefully provide a lower debt or a lower cost of investment for the utility customers. They're going to stress that a lot. Now, they have a lot of debt. So that's the problem.
They have a lot of debt. Two things. How much do you know about the lawsuits that they're facing? In particular, the one with the co-ops suing them because they want them to pay for the nuclear plants that will never produce.
Anybody know about this besides her? Okay, yeah, you know. Okay, so Santee Cooper, like SCE&G's customers, sued SCE&G after the nuclear fallout. And you may have gotten, if you were a Dominion customer, a small check. So that was the settlement that some plaintiffs' attorneys reached on your behalf.
Right.
There's this side lawsuit that's still going on where co-op customers and Santee Cooper's direct customers are suing them. That's going to result in a trial come February, where they're going to decide whether Santee Cooper can continue to charge its customers for the nuclear reactors. There's a statute, and the thing it's really going to hinge on is there's a statute in state law that says a plant must be, quote, used and useful in order for you to be able to be charged for it. SCANA didn't have that problem because they rewrote the law for them. So the judge in that case, which is a former Supreme Court justice, will have to decide whether or not co-op customers and Santee Cooper customers should have to continue to pay for those reactors. And if they don't, then it starts a whole nother legal headache where Santee Cooper is saying, we shouldn't have to pay that cost either. SCANA should, because you were in charge of the project for us. And then SCANA's pointing the finger back at other people. And it is quite a mess.
Andy, how does offshore wind factor into the future energy mix?
Currently no plans for offshore wind here in South Carolina. I'm not smart enough to know whether that's something that is capable here on the shores of South Carolina. It all depends on, the strength of the wind off the coast and stuff. I will say that one of the few projects in the country that is being considered is a Dominion project. So up in Virginia, they are pursuing an offshore wind project off the coast of Virginia that would be one of the first completed wind projects in the country. And so Dominion's the same owner of SCE&G. It's just, I think they got some financial incentives to do that up in Virginia versus here. So it's possible, and people are looking into it. The technology, like solar, I assume, is probably improving, the reliability of it. It's like offshore drilling, though. It's quite costly. You have to make sure you go out there to do repairs on that. You have to send a full crew on a boat. It's not driving down a dirt road to fix a wind turbine, right? So
I would just like to add that as bleak as it seems with the PSC, we are not 100% helpless in this regard. But what I mean by that is because there are 4 new commissioners that potentially can be appointed in congressional districts 1, 3, 5, and 7, there are some really talented, thoughtful, mindful people who have put their name in the hat. And so once they go through the testing and the vetting process, they're going to announce 3 people from each district widely, right? They're going to say in District 1 is this person, this person, this person. And then that's when we as people, as individuals, can have a real say, because our legislators who appoint the person are going to listen to us, because if they don't listen to us, and enough of us make enough noise, when it's time for them to be reelected, there's a high chance that they won't be reelected. So number one is there's some very good people who have applied to be a part of this, but then some of it's gonna be on us in 2020 when they announce those names and say, this person, this person, this person, your congressional district is running. If you like any of them, that's when we can start calling our legislators, we can start showing up at their offices. We do postcard letter, we help people write postcards, like we're doing the town hall. I mean, there's noise that can be made. So you're not 100% helpless in this.
Right. I mean, you elect these state lawmakers, and they're all up for all the state lawmakers are up for re-election next year too.
So typically then they propose a slate of potential appointments. So it's not.
People throw their name.
People apply.
Oh, people apply, okay.
So you could have applied if you know about it. Right. You could have applied.
You apply, you have to have like a bachelor's degree, I think, some like either legal, engineering, there's a group of experience that you need to have, at least a limited. And then they bring you in for these hearings where they vet your experience and what you think, and then it's a committee. Then they pass the top prospects up, or they're supposed to pass the top prospects
So
up.
the full House votes on it?
I believe it's by congression. It would be the full House. I believe so. Is it, or is it by congressional district still?
It's the House.
Okay.
So to your point though, to be impactful, would have to basically follow those committee time and travel to Columbia.
No. You don't have to go to Columbia. They're gonna send a press release out when these 3 names get selected.
Yeah, you just
Organizations like us, Andy will write about it. We have a huge database. There's a coalition of people who are conservation minded. They'll be writing about it. The names will be out there. Then it's up to us to activate and mobilize people and say, hey, these are the 3 names. Some people will out and out endorse and say, we think you should call this person. Some organizations are just gonna put it out there for everyone. But you can do something about
Your
it.
organization, for example, have a voice in that process, in that committee hearing?
No.
what you do is, I mean, you find out who your local lawmaker is. You say,
Right.
I think these PSC decisions are important. This is the person who I think, they're not allowed, until the vote is cast, they're not allowed to give a promise of supporting someone. They're just not allowed. But you can say who you support and who you think they should support.
I just thought there would be, public comment, period where people voice, endorsement or, speak against a particular candidate because of potential ties, and it's in a public forum. I mean, sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
In public hearings.
Yeah, you can go up there. There's public hearings.
No, it's not set. There's not like a day you go and say, yes, I like this person, or no, I don't. But once those names get announced, then you can like you said, you can start calling your legislator and be like, yo, I like this person, I like this person. Get your friends to do it, get your church to do it, get your whoever. So you can start getting those mindful, thoughtful, considerate people in those seats.
And that's the only way we can keep them accountable and have a check on it. Yes.
Well, part of it you already alluded to is why it's a bit messy, for lack of a better term, is we're not engaged citizens in energy. We're not educated, motivated, and active as we should be, more so, and held people accountable. And unfortunately, it's set up to make it hard to be accountable, but there's still through the citizen engagement, whether it's showing up, postcards, making phone calls, we can make a difference. Even with the Santee Cooper situation, we don't get to vote, but we certainly can call and express our opinion to our elected officials.
Yeah, state lawmakers select those board members too of Santee Cooper. So
yeah, they need to hear from us.
this is
Our
it.
concern.
I mean, this is complicated stuff. I would forgive someone for not fully understanding this. You've never touched this before. I had to do introduction slides just to show you where the energy markets are, right? But once you get the basic understanding of who the large players are and how the system works, yeah, I think you can advocate a little bit more. And right.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So it's I think the point of all of this presentation and what I've talked to other people about is the nuclear reactor, while terrible and costs ratepayers a lot of money, it's opened the door to a lot of change in South Carolina. I think people are more more aware of whenever their utility bill shows up every month now. I think they're aware of the processes that are in place of how these decisions are being made, which is probably a good thing. It sucks that it took that to do it.
Right.
Well, on that note, I'm gonna kind of close it off here, but before we end, I just want to thank Andy and the Post and Courier for informing us and keeping everyone informed about this and how they're
Okay.